The UFC has quickly become one of the world's most valuable sports organizations. The company now brings in more than $1 billion in annual revenue. They signed a 5-year broadcast deal with ESPN in 2018, worth $1.5 billion. And after being acquired by Endeavor and going public last year, the business is now worth about $10 billion. But this success didn't happen overnight. In fact, it almost didn't happen at all. When Dana White and Franklin Lorenzo Fertitta acquired the UFC in 2001, the business was on the verge of bankruptcy. They paid $2 million for the entire operation, but MMA still wasn't recognized as a sanctioned sport, and they received nothing more than a trademark for the UFC name. There were no assets, no revenue, and barely any demand. So how did they do it? How did the UFC go from a business on the verge of bankruptcy with no commercial appeal to a $10 billion juggernaut today? This is the story of how Dana White built the UFC into a $10 billion empire. To really understand the UFC story, we need to go all the way back to the early 1990s. There was a salesman named Art Davie who took boxing classes as a child and eventually became obsessed with figuring out who the world's best fighter was. One day he came across an article in Playboy magazine about a Brazilian jiu-jitsu school in Los Angeles that was run by Rorion Gracie. The idea was pretty simple. The Gracie family had essentially invented Brazilian jiu-jitsu and were frequently beating people 2 to 3 times their size in Brazil. So they came to America to showcase the effectiveness of the system and started beating martial artists from all backgrounds that visited their gym. This intrigued Art Davie, so he approached Rorion Gracie with an idea: a single elimination, one night, no rules combat tournament. This meant karate would face off against jiu-jitsu and boxing against judo. But more importantly, the tournament would determine the world's best fighter. So the two men agreed on a partnership and set off to organize the event. But there was just one problem. No one wanted the TV rights. Boxing promoters and executives at HBO, Showtime, ESPN, and many other networks thought this was a terrible idea and didn't want to assume the risk, given it was an unsanctioned sport. But still, Art Davie and Rorion Gracie kept calling around, and eventually they convinced a new upstart company called Semaphore Entertainment Group to air the event. They then raised $200,000 from Rorion's students to fund the tournament, and decided to host the event in Colorado because the state didn't have a boxing commission, which meant less regulation, less red tape, and fewer legal hurdles. The only rules were no eye gouging and no biting, but there was no time limit, and the referee couldn't stop the fight unless there was a knockout, submission, a fighter tap, or the corner throws in the towel. It was about as ruthless as you could get, but the tournament's winner was set to be paid $50,000, and just like that, the UFC was born. The first UFC event ended up doing an impressive 86,000 pay-per-view buys, but the production quality wasn't very good, and many people couldn't believe the extreme violence. The New York Times published an article titled, "Death is Cheap. Maybe it's just $14.95. And Senator John McCain called it human cockfighting and attempted to get the UFC banned in all 50 states. So even with strong consumer demand, the risks were mounting. Art Davie famously told ESPN, "I don't think the New York Times is going away. I don't think John McCain is going away. I said, I wouldn't be surprised if President Bill Clinton comes out against this. I mean, it's possible." And it only got worse. By UFC 12, as many as 36 states had banned the UFC from holding events in their states, and they had even stopped allowing customers to buy them on pay-per-view. This meant that the sport needed to get cleaned up. But even after spending years adding additional rules, weight classes, time limits, and judges, boxing commissions and politicians still weren't very happy. So Rorion Gracie and Art Davie made the difficult decision to sell their equity in the UFC to Bob Marovitz, the president and CEO of Semaphore Entertainment Group. But that didn't last long either. Bob Marovitz ran the UFC for another couple of years, but he was losing millions of dollars, spending a ton of time in court, and the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. This is where Dana White comes in. Dana moved from Boston to Las Vegas in the late 1990s, and after spending a few years as a boxing trainer, he started managing UFC fighters like Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell. The fighters weren't making much money with the UFC, and neither was Dana, but this led to a conversation that would change his life forever. Dana was negotiating a deal for one of his fighters with the UFC when Bob Marovitz frustratingly said, "There is no more money. I don't even know if I have enough money to put on one more event." So Dana sensed an opportunity and called his friends, Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta, who were co-founders of a Las Vegas casino business called Station Casinos. They talked through the details, spent a few months negotiating, and eventually purchased the UFC for $2 million in January 2001. Dana White was then named president of the company and received an equity stake. But still, from 2001 to 2004, things didn't exactly go as planned. The UFC was able to convince state commissions in New Jersey and Nevada to legalize the sport, and they had a few thousand people showing up at each event. but the company lost more than $44 million in just 3 years. And in 2004, Lorenzo Fertitta was tired of continuously writing checks and asked Dana White to see how much they could sell the UFC for. It became a very emotional issue for me. It was something that I dearly loved, being involved in the fight game and the UFC. But we kept having these funding requests, and there was no end in sight, Fertitta told the Las Vegas Sun. But Dana White was only able to find an offer that guaranteed them a multi-million-dollar loss. So the Fertitta brothers decided to keep going and try one last idea. In late 2004, Dana White and the Fertittas invested $10 million to create a show called The Ultimate Fighter. It was a reality TV show about 16 fighters who were split into 2 teams and coached by UFC fighters. They lived together, trained together, and fought each other for a UFC contract. But while shows like Formula One's Drive to Survive are immensely popular today, this was a relatively new concept in 2004, and the UFC was still seen as a risk to TV producers. So all the big broadcasters, including NBC, ABC, CBS, and ESPN, turned them down. And they were only able to find a home for the show on Spike TV after agreeing to give them the content for free and pay the $10 million in production costs themselves. That ended up being a smart move though, because while they didn't receive any upfront cash for the show, and $10 million was a lot of money to invest in a company that had already lost $44 million, The Ultimate Fighter ended up being a huge success, and it's the main reason that the UFC still exists today. For example, the first season of The Ultimate Fighter had 0 advertising, but the final fight between Forrest Griffin and Stefan Bonner ended up peaking at 10 million viewers, which was significantly more than Spike TV expected, and it even outdrew the Masters that day on CBS. This led Spike TV to pick up the show for a second season, which they paid for this time around. But more importantly, it introduced the UFC to the world and kickstarted a multi-decade period of growth. The UFC saw its annual revenue go from $14 million in 2004 to $180 million by 2006. This increase in revenue enabled them to start expanding, primarily through acquisition. The UFC spent the next 5 years strategically acquiring competitors like World Extreme Cage Fighting, the Pride Fighting Championship, International Fight League, Strikeforce, and others. This reduced their competition and enabled the UFC to add an entertaining mix of domestic and international stars to their roster, including Quinton Rampage Jackson, Mauricio Shogun Rua, Nick Diaz, Tyron Woodley, Daniel Cormier, and Ronda Rousey. Then, in 2011, the UFC signed a 7-year media rights deal with Fox Sports that was worth at least $100 million. The deal guaranteed them at least 4 UFC events each year would air on Fox networks in prime time, and it gave them a much bigger platform for their show, The Ultimate Fighter. But the deals didn't stop there. The UFC also signed a 6-year, $70 million deal that made Reebok their official apparel partner. Now, some of the fighters criticized this move because it disallowed them from selling their own individual sponsors on their fight kit. But Dana White felt that it was imperative that the UFC cleaned up its look if they wanted to drastically increase the value of their next media rights deal. So fast forward a few years, and the UFC continued to grow. They were now putting on more than 500 fights each year. They had created legitimate superstars like Chuck Liddell, Brock Lesnar, Georges St. Pierre, and Anderson Silva, and the business was generating nearly $700 million in annual revenue. That made the UFC one of the fastest growing sports properties globally, and now that it was legalized in all 50 states, everyone wanted a piece of the business. So in 2016, the UFC was sold for $4 billion to WME IMG, which then became Endeavor. This was the largest sale in sports history at the time, and several other high-profile celebrities wrote checks to invest in the UFC, including Jimmy Kimmel, Sylvester Stallone, Mark Wahlberg, Ben Affleck, Rob Dyrdek, Robert Kraft, Cam Newton, Serena and Venus Williams, and Maria Sharapova. Now, a $4 billion sale was obviously an amazing outcome for a business that was acquired for just $2 million a little more than a decade prior. But rather than cash out and enjoy retirement, Dana White agreed to stay on as president of the UFC and continue to push the organization to new heights. For example, after its deal ended with Fox Sports in 2018, the UFC signed a 5-year, $1.5 billion deal with ESPN. This placed 30 UFC Fight Night events on ESPN networks each year, and it guaranteed the UFC at least $300 million in annual income, or 15 times more than their previous media deal paid. Of course, this doesn't mean that everything has gone right for the UFC. Competitors like Bellator and PFL have started to attract and sign some legitimate fighters, like their homegrown star Kayla Harrison, as well as former UFC fighters like Anthony Pettis and Jeremy Stevens. And furthermore, the UFC is currently facing an active lawsuit from former fighters that claim the promotion is a monopoly, and they are consistently and publicly criticized for only paying about 16% of their annual revenue to fighters, compared to leagues like the NFL, NBA, and MLB, which all have unions and split revenue 50-50 with its players. But still, the UFC is an incredibly impressive business. Dana White and the Fertitta brothers acquired an asset that many people didn't think was valuable, and they nearly lost $50 million trying to build it. But less than 2 decades later, the company now does more than $1 billion in annual revenue. It's one of the fastest growing sports organizations globally, and each of them personally made hundreds of millions of dollars on the deal. So we'll see what happens from here, but I think the UFC is only going to get bigger.